What does it mean to be an innovator, an influencer, someone who is changing our communities? Today's guest, Khalil Graham, is exactly that man. We're talking to an amazing individual who is changing how education impacts the next generation. We're going to talk about the key role of accountability, executive function, and how we're helping the younger generations be prepared with the skills that they need to navigate an uncertain future. One thing can be certain about this conversation. We're going to learn what true innovation looks like from a grassroots perspective. Khalil Graham joins the show today, guys. Let's have an amazing conversation. Let's get to it.
As Kairos starts to graduate young people and put them in to not only the community force, but the workforce, to see how our students can have tangible effects on their family and the community around economic reform and community reform. So when we see kids who are changing the dynamic in their family's financial structure, when they're changing the dynamic in the community structures because they understand being an empowered citizen, but being excited about long-term, being able to say, here's the real impact. Our students have added, $10 million to the local community through the jobs that they've created for others and the businesses they've created. Our students, for their families, 80% of them who started below the poverty line are now above the poverty line and have families that, they define as healthy and functional.
In our previous conversation, you talked a little bit about how education seems to be one of the only systems where we're not looking for user feedback from the people who are actually going through the system to actually be able to inform what the education process looks like. Why do you think we've gotten it wrong for so long, Khalil?
One of the things that I'm really thoughtful on is for many years, the adults have seen the system as one that we own and children are an output, as opposed to children being key stakeholders in the process that they are going through as it evolves and continues to iterate while they're actually going through their education journey. And that's a great place for not only feedback, but also for finding solutions to problems that we don't intimately experience like they do. And so I think that for many years, it's been a place where adults, educators in the system who've got experience just haven't seen the value in the stakeholders of children, students going through, whether they're younger children in elementary or high school or alumni from K through 12 who've been through it and can reflect on their experience.
I'm really interested in how you guys are doing things differently. In our previous conversation, we talked about executive function, skill sets that these students are going to need to learn and develop early in life so they can be more effective when they're making big decisions and they come across times of adversity. Why are we focusing on the skill development over just the same playbook that we've seen for so long?
Yeah, I think we've learned through data that playbook needs to be refined, right? And for us, building choice and understanding of choice and not only repercussions, but strategies to continue to evolve your reflections on choice is so important because we know as adults, we make thousands of choices in a day. And over the course of a year, the choices add up to not only the experiences that we have, but the outcomes that we receive, right? And if we look at the goal of education is to make students really great choice makers in the avenues, in the communities, in the careers they decide to serve, you would backwards map differently than if the goal is just for them to learn a standard or to master a certain set of material. And I think for us, with that being the end game, we want change makers by being able to make powerful choices that both inform them in their lives, but the communities and the fields they want to serve. It really has pushed us to rethink how we want to model what's going on in our classrooms and how do we want to involve kids in that experience and that families in that experience as well.
It's interesting. I've been talking a lot on the podcast recently about the idea I refer to as the instant gratification trap. Right? It's very easy for us in society today to look at younger generations and say, you guys want instant gratification from the things you integrate with, the things you interact with, from all the different tools that you use, Uber, everything else gives us that instant gratification. But when I think about the changes that we're really looking for in our society today, our education system can't fall trap to that instant gratification trap either. We need to invest into these children so they can be the future that we want to see in our communities. And I think in society, we're yearning for that more than ever, man.
Yeah, one of the things I'm cognizant of is the students and the young people we work with, they learn some of that from the adults, right? And for us, it's being really thoughtful around how are we making sure they see the forest beyond the trees. And how are we seeing that in the field and knowing that the real win for a student in kindergarten doesn't happen in kindergarten, but it happens way after they've left school and some of the foundational pieces build into the experiential pieces that they have through their journey. And when they activate that real understanding of purpose and what they want to do, how they take all those tools, wrap them together into a purposeful and choice filled life. And so if we see all the not only complexity, but the steps along the way, we realize that there's not one test that defines success. There's not one accolade or achievement in their journey that defines success, but it's much more all of the things accumulated together and then being able to reflect on the experience and all the tools they've learned and use that toolkit as purposeful adults, purposeful parents, purposeful engaged citizens in their community.
I want to get a little tactical here and give you the opportunity to articulate how you guys are doing things differently. The majority of people who are listening to this podcast, right, have gone through education. We've all have similarities in the experiences that we've been through. So what makes what you guys are doing so much different than what we all experienced in education and often didn't really like?
Yeah, I think at Kairos, what we really are thinking about is if we started from scratch and we said, how do we both take things that we know are tried and true in education and take places where we want to test and experiment? What would school look like? And things that people would notice if you came and walked through our halls. There's a lot of freedom of movement in our school. Students, when we talk about choice and them having the ability to not only work in different sections of the school, but also really thinking about what career paths they want to choose, what's the pace they want to work on with assignments. Those are things that we've given a lot more leeway than many other school environments may or may not feel comfortable with or have the structures for. And so there might be a student in one class who's working on science because they're really engaged and they took a trip to the hospital and they feel like, hey, that's a career path that they want to explore and science is something that they want to get a little ahead on. And in that same room, we might have a student who is excited about math or reading who got a chance to not only see something through our experiences, but through something they learned at home or in the community, and they want to accelerate there. And so in our rooms, we know that personalized learning means that we have to give kids space to make personalized choices. And that for us, we feel is a real part of the fabric of who we are and also allows for the young people to be more engaged in the experience they have day to day. And so we think that those are some of the pieces that people might see coming through our halls. And then also how we build our students up to advocate for themselves, because we do want, whether you're a middle school student who is learning about how to make choices and articulate what are the things that will help you in terms of the goals you set and the pathway you want to take, or if we have high school students who have a really solid understanding of where they want to go and are talking to us about what courses they might need to take or what kind of ways we can enhance their experience so that they do get more access to those lifelong goals that they have. We really want that to be a communal and conversational path that we have with students.
Man, this feels so refreshing compared to where we came from in the idea, or I would say the overgeneralization that kids don't know what they want. And so we have to tell them what path they're going to go down. How do you kind of swerve against that mindset? Because it seems like it's been so ingrained in the education process. Like, you students don't know anything yet. You're not old enough to make these type of decisions. So how do we kind of combat some of the haters out there that might be saying you guys are doing it wrong?
Yeah, thinking about a customer service mindset. And in a school, you have to really define what your customer base is, just like any other industry. And for us, there was, I think, a long-term notion that the customer was the parent or the family. And that was like the number one place to serve and the only place to serve. If the parent was happy, mom and dad, or, whatever that family structure is, then you're doing a great job. We didn't articulate what we wanted the customer satisfaction to be for our students. And then the reality is, number one, our students spend the most time with us. And what we're saying now post COVID is students are making purposeful choices on, is school the right place for them? And is your school the right place for them? And so they've started to really strengthen their voice around, if a school or a school environment isn't for them, they will try other options. They will start businesses. They will name to the public why the school isn't the right place for them. And so, as that's become an increased reality, I think it's pushed everybody to engage with that in different ways. I think in our market and with the students that we serve, we just wanted to be ahead of the curve and give them the opportunity to have a seat at the table, have a voice on things that we know are important to their experience. And then we've tracked how that's related to not only them attending school, but them being more engaged throughout the school experience.
This sounds so refreshing to me. As we sit here and I just hear the thoughtfulness and the intentionality that goes into creating an overall experience, but also a brand that people want to be a part of. There are so many opportunities for students today to be able to make money in so many different ways. And I'm not sure why, but there's a young kid who became really, really famous on YouTube because his parents were having him test out different toys that they would buy him. Turned into a Disney deal. This kid's making like 30 million bucks a year. And I think there's a little bit of our societal subconscious mind that says a lot of parents might be thinking about different paths for their kids to be able to make a living and just improve their lifestyle in general. And so when it comes to the education experience, it has to be curated for people to do what they want to do, have a good experience, and then be able to get the benefit out of the entire process that maybe they'd be able to experience in different areas of life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I find myself going back and forth on the notion of, when I got in the education field, almost 20 years ago, one of the big things we really grounded on in the reform movement was the idea of college for all, and thinking that that would be the equity lens, the liberation lens that we would have to help students who come from backgrounds where they were disadvantaged or not receiving the results that the majority was having across our country. I think we go 20 years later into the field, and it's not necessarily college for all, but it's much more the idea of a purposeful next step, knowing that college might not be that purposeful next step for a certain student, but they should have access to all the things that a purposeful next step can entail. And so you got to give them the academic preparation where if an academic future is in their path, they can go that way. But you also need to give them the understanding of the world and the community around them so that they can go and look and see what options they have. And I think whether it's with social media, with AI, with technology in general, there are so many more doors and pathways that can be open for the creative mind than we've ever had before. And our young people have much more reach with that because they're just exploring it. They're open. Their mindsets are ones of curiosity and wonder much more than many of adults who didn't grow up with a certain technology or not necessarily trust a certain technology. Every kid that I see now has grown up with a cell phone. They've grown up with access to Wikipedia, different things that just have opened the world for them. And I think that that gives them an advantage in many ways in terms of looking at alternative pathways that really can not only produce revenue, but also can just give them life satisfaction.
I want to I want to dive into the idea of the laggard mindset, right? The people who aren't willing to view this new opportunity of education through the lens of curiosity and how we can do things differently to be able to provide value. Do you feel like the majority of the institutions that we're seeing across the landscape of education might be a little bit slow to the draw, which is going to kind of cause some problems for the future generations of people who are entering into the workforce and everything else?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are waiting for quote unquote the new way of teaching, the new way of learning to show tangible long-term results before they adopt, right? Those late adopters, late adapters that we might see. And I think the reality is that we've seen over the course of history that when we have the multitude that are waiting to adopt, that's going to slow evolution. That's going to slow the reforms that we want to see. There are always going to be those people. And the reality is we need space for people who want to do things the old way, right? There are schools that make sense that have different teachings and styles that are 40 and 50 years old, right? And there are certain students, certain families that might find value in that education. The whole idea of having choice for how to educate your child is you can choose things that worked many years ago. You can choose things that have just been tried for the first time, but you and your family can make an informed choice. And I think that we have probably too many systems that feel like they need to wait to see a proof of concept. And even when they get that proof of concept, they now say, well, I need to see 2, I need to see 5, I need to see 10 years of proof of concept. And by that time, the child's out of your system anyway, right? And so how do we make space for smart tests where you can try something new and get a chance to see if it works for a segment of your students or for a certain population of students, as opposed to waiting for the whole industry to make a turn and decide that something's the right way to go? I think that we just need to do a better job with the kids that we're working with now to provide more of those doors to opportunities to be open.
I think there's a key differentiator here in the mindset of decision making versus running experiments. Decisions feel very solidified. They feel very, I would say, ultimate in the direction in which we move, which is the people who are looking for the 1, the 5, the 10 years of data to be able to reinforce the decision that they made. But the experimentation culture is really interesting to me. You said something there, smart tests. What did that mean? What was that?
And so the whole idea in school form around school choice, charter schools, lots of those different notions that have come up, it really is grounded in there were school sites that wanted to identify how to test if something was a need for the community or if this was a certain type of learning style that could benefit their students. So that's where charter schools in many ways came from. A school or an environment saying, hey, we noticed that this is a gap and we want to be able to test if this type of alternative learning platform or style can help the students that we serve. So it's an incubation site for school testing and for education reform testing. When you think about a smart test, you want those incubation sites for really looking at different ways for learning to happen, for teaching to happen, to have enough of a structure where you can actually use the data and decide if it's something that can be implemented at scale. And so a simple example I would always say is you want to have a school, you probably need to decide who's going to run the school, where the school will be located, how many students should the school serve. There's certain things you'd want to have on the front end that'll help you to do a smart test, as opposed to saying we have an idea that we want to have a great school, but we don't know where it's going to be. We don't know how many kids are going to be there, but give us the access to do it and we'll see what happens. That could lead to a lot of delays in being able to run the school in a way that will give you data that's worthwhile. Because if one day you've got 10 students and the next day you've got 200 students, you probably don't have systems to serve both well at the same time. And so it might hold you back. And so I think that idea of a smart test is how do you make the right structures and what we might think of as creating the right box so that whatever the test is has the controls that allow the data for us to be actionable and be able to interpret in a way that's going to make meaning to the field of work we're in.
Why have you become such an innovator in this space? I want to kind of give everybody an understanding of your background. You spent time in higher education, and now we're innovating at a level where we're going to be able to impact generations in the future. But why did we kind of go down this path, man?
Yeah, I think it all starts with having a heart and service mindset for kids. I tell people at the root of it all, I'm a kid from Brooklyn who really just grew up with a lot of fortune, a lot of people cheering me on and opening doors for me. And I want to pay that forward for the communities that I've been, blessed to serve. And so when I think about innovation, I know that if something had been tried and true to work for every student in every school across the country, we would have figured out education. It'd be working great everywhere and there would be end of story, period, right? The reality is that we know that it's going to take different thinking to solve what are the problems of our time with our schools and the things that we want to do better for our kids. And so being a person, somebody's got to stand at the front. And, I see myself as somebody who's not scared to stand out in the front and be a partner for our students, for our communities, and really be a translator of how do we bring the resources to the table that we think will best support our kids and their families in making the progress in their journey. And I think when you simplify it in that way, the innovations, whether they're systematic, whether they're technical, whether they're actually teaching and learning based, just give you a place of really holistically understanding the goal is to be better for students tomorrow than we were today. And if we want to continue to do that, we've got to listen to them. We've got to look at data and we've got to be really passionate about pushing through the changes that we think will be best for the people we want to serve.
I think about moving on a longer timeline, right? Extending the time horizon between the impact that we're trying to have, which gives us flexibility to experiment in the now moment to be able to create the incomes later down the road. Do you ever get looked at as kind of a threat in the space of education? Because I speak to a lot of, institutions and a lot of leaders in education, and often they are not as quick nor comfortable with moving at a different pace as you are. And I can understand how that could be kind of threatening for some people.
Yeah, and honestly, I think when I started, I probably was closer to the norm than I am to where I am now, where I see myself much more as a person who's got to be courageous for the liberation of our kids. And knowing that at the end of the day, if you define success and failure by one moment and one indicator, it's going to be hard for you ever to win the long game. And if you really care about kids, winning the long game is what we want to do. And for me, that win comes from being able to say, it's not a test, it's not a specific skill, but it's a holistic experience and a holistic refinement of the system we have that's going to bring us to where kids get the education they deserve and our communities have the young people equipped with the skills they deserve. And if you don't believe in that long game, it's really hard because the reality is every day there's an opportunity to define success and failure by one specific data point. But if that's the only thing you use, or the ones that are the common natured ones in testing and, accountability from the state, those are made many times to have a high floor or a floor at all in terms of what we expect for kids and what we expect for schools. We've never made an accountability system that pushes the ceiling of innovation, that pushes the what's next for students. They're all made with I think, a lot of fear of what will happen if we don't, as opposed to what will happen if we try. And so we want to be a place where we're trying and we're really pushing the envelope as much as possible.
I want to talk a little bit about you, man. How did you develop this kind of mindset? You know what I mean? It's incredibly refreshing to sit across this digital table with somebody who has just like such a grounded understanding and everything that we're talking about here. But like, how did you develop this in yourself? If you came from higher education, you said that you once weren't like this compared to how you are now. What has the process been like for you?
Yeah, I like to think that I stand on the shoulders of giants, right? I've been really blessed in my career to work with education leaders who not only aren't scared to try different things, but also push my thinking and my own reflection on why I not only thought the way I did, but I valued certain things. I could think as early as, my grandmother, who was an education advocate, who pushed me to think about like what was my role in school as a young Black man growing up in Brooklyn, New York, to working for people like Michelle Rhee, who, as Chancellor of DC Public Schools, was a person who really thought, what if we just tried something new and really thought about how we evaluate teachers or how we evaluate school success in a way that's never been done before. Like, you meet these people and they plant seeds along the way. And as you continue to get experience, I call that like watering the seeds, because then as those ideas sprout, I can make sense and meaning of them in a different way. And it's once you have the sense and the knowledge, do you have the courage to act on it? And I think as I've gotten more senior and more seasoned in my career, one of the things that I said I want my legacy to be is not somebody who carried the ball and decided I was going to do the same thing all the people before me did, but was going to try to go a different way, try to run a little bit faster, and try to be a little bit more thoughtful around what can I do to engage others along that process so that when we finish the game, we are in a much different place than we were when we started.
I want to talk about the role of the teacher in this process. Now, let me level set. One of the things that I've recognized is a lot of teachers today find themselves challenged to be able to get the results that they believe their students should be getting because of some of the invisible, I would say, barriers like the standardized tests and everything else that we see in a lot of the public school systems. So what is the role in influencing the next generation of these great leaders and thinkers from your guys' perspective that might be a little contrarian to kind of how we think about educators in maybe the public space or in different systems?
Yeah, giving teachers a seat at the table for the evolution of the work that they do, it's going to be critical to solving not only the national teacher shortage, but if we dig deeper, the quality teacher shortage is happening because in many places we're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. You think the world has changed in the last 5 years in so many ways, but in many places they want teachers and teaching and learning to look the same way it did pre-COVID, all of those different constituents and considerations, right? And so for me, I go to the grounding of, if you give a person a seat at the table, then you can start to learn things and you can start to have them be active participants in the change process. one of the things I think about most with the role of the teacher is what do we want them doing in the classroom? Do we want them to do that idea of like stand and deliver, where they're the person at the front pointing at the chalkboard with the piece of chalk and the pointer for an hour to students, and students take notes and don't really talk much? Or do we want them to engage in collective discourse in the room? Do we want projects to be done where there's sense making throughout the learning and the engagement with a project? And for us, we lean more on the latter, where we want our teachers to facilitate learning experiences as much as possible. And we know that that comes with the idea of you do have to have common standards that you work towards, and you've got to make sure that there's interventions in place for students who need particular supports. But growing in a world where, even if you look at higher ed is changing in terms of what's happening in classrooms and what kind of role do they want teachers and students to have in their experience, because the choice that we see students making many times is to decide if higher ed is for them or if it isn't. And if they're making that choice, the higher ed environment's had to change. I think you're seeing the trickle down now, and we want to be ahead of that curve and saying, how do we create experiences that will make our teachers feel empowered to really lean into the things we need to do with our students? On the other side, in the public sector, in public education, we know that there's still a lot of standard operating procedures that need to be done for the sake of accountability, compliance, and those things. And so we're continuing, like everybody else, to try to test how to balance those things. I think for us, we want to have teachers at the seat at the table. We want to be really thoughtful of what are the things that are most important to people coming into the profession: relationships with students, the opportunity to engage authentically and enthusiastically with materials and content with them, and creating shared experiences. That's what many teachers get in and stay in the field for. How do we build as much time for that for them as possible? And then look at the other things that were a part of the traditional teaching experience and say, what if we do it differently? And being okay with finding out some answers along the way.
The teachers who are coming into the space, let's say millennials, Gen Z, Alpha, who's going to come after them, are they prepared to teach in the same fashion that we're talking about, or are they having to make an adjustment as they come through the education process standard through higher ed?
Yeah. So I think that there's a duality here because, on one side, teachers are coming in with more of those executive functioning skills in many places, like because they've been in the world, they've engaged with technology, they've had to be more collaborative in their school experience and in their world experience than many people have had to do in previous generations. On the other side, there aren't as many people going through the traditional teaching pathway, going to a teacher's college, a higher education program, being a teaching assistant, and coming up. That's not happening as much in the field, in my opinion. And I think part of that is there's more choices for what kind of opportunities and options young people can do as they're building up what's the career of choice they want to have and they enter the workforce. And so, I tell people all the time here in St. Louis that, in a world where a person can work at Amazon or work at Uber or do different things to earn a livable wage, going into the classroom where you're going to have accountability, you're going to have to work obviously with a lot of young people who on many days can be challenging, right? You're going to have to build skills that take time and perseverance and commitment to do. And we need to do a better job in selling the why behind that being a purposeful choice, because it is a world where, people switch career pathways. People are open to trying new things, but also if it doesn't feel right, trying something else. And teaching is one of those professions where, sad but true, you got to give it time, right? It's like Novocaine, you got to give it time to work. It's not necessarily going to be a thing that immediately comes into place and, all of a sudden you figured it all out. It sometimes takes years to people to really get that momentum they need. And in the world we live in, many people have the tools. We've got to make sure we build the relationships, build the connection so that they give it time to mature and those tools can turn into outcomes for young people.
How are you thinking about your role in inspiring the next generation of these great leaders to be able to be a part of this vision that you're casting, the why that we were just kind of talking about?
Yeah, I think about that more than ever now. When I started in education leadership, maybe a decade ago, a big part of it was what I call like technical and adaptive leadership. Like, can you be the person to help your people get skills? Can you be the person that helps your people solve problems? Now I think more about inspirational leadership and how do you give people conviction to go on a journey, because that's what education is. That's what life is in many ways. You're going on a journey, and in leadership, you need to bring people along with you. right? And so for me, not only do I think about how do I do it, but how do I build that skill in the people under me, many of who have been promoted because of their technical expertise, their ability to adaptively solve challenges that come up in their work stream. The next level up is how do you collectively invest others to go with you, right? You think about the role of a teacher who has to inspire a class to go on a journey versus a principal who has to inspire a school to go on a journey. Every level up, you still need that inspiration because the journey is building the right behaviors again and again and learning from the challenges that come up. And I think that if people are invested in that, that's where we will see the education game really move forward because we got to get past the number. We got to get past a specific skill or having the classroom look a very certain way to saying we've got to be willing to explore and listen and iterate and get people collectively invested in that journey because when they're invested in the journey, then the group has power as opposed to just an individual feeling like they're isolated on their own.
If you could go back to a younger version of yourself and have a 5 minute sit down and give that person a piece of advice on how they should navigate the future, things they should lean into, or things that maybe they should avoid, what advice would you give to them?
I probably would remind myself that it's okay to listen. You don't have to have an answer right away. And be okay with saying, I don't know, just as fast as you can be okay with saying, I know and I want to work on this. Like that idea of reflection, that idea of being a deep thinker is something I value much more now in my career. I actually schedule it to have it on my calendar, to have time to think about things, as opposed to when I was younger, there was a rush to be right. There was a rush to be the first to answer, the first to do, the first to action. And I realize now, as I've gotten a little bit, wiser, I'd like to think that you don't have to be first if you're going to do it right. And that's the way where the thoughtfulness, the consideration, the being able to reflect on things has become more impactful in me in the career. And I think if I knew that a decade ago or even farther, it might have, given me a space not only to make better choices, but to help other people make better choices.
Hindsight is 2020. Being able to look back in the past and say, hey, I would have done this differently is a big exercise in maturation, but also an exercise in being reflective on how we can do things differently in the future. If you don't mind me asking, some of those rushed decisions, if you will, what did those represent in your career, if you feel okay sharing?
Yeah, I think, in looking at being a young leader, one of the things that was really important to me was status, right? Do people see me as a high achiever? Do people see me as somebody who can be promoted or who is leading in the industry or the field at the time? And so that hunger to achieve, which I think many, young people in their career are trying to prove themselves, that led me to make choices that looking back, I probably might have done some things differently, and specifically in like how I showed up in a space, how collaborative was I, how much of a listener and a person who wanted to really experience learning from failure would have happened a lot faster. I had to get comfortable with myself to know that it's not about being seen as the best. It's about do you intrinsically know that you've given the best effort and that you're always willing to get a little bit better for the people you serve? Because that's excellence in many ways, trying to be better than you were before and learning along the way on like how to build better systems, better behaviors that help people. And I think that that's a part for me that I've learned along the way that it comes from, making some choices and then being able to reflect on them and think about how you could do it differently.
I'm interested in how you view yourself and your identity, right? When we're a high achiever, often we tie our identity to the work and the outcomes that we produce. As I've gotten older, I've really started to try and focus on the element of me being able to separate Keenan from the business, from the work, from the podcast, everything else, just like that, that I do. And so how have you been able to keep those two things separate? Because it's really important that we don't become engulfed in the identity of the work that we do.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that sets in as you get older is there's a different sense of mortality, right? When you get upper in age and you're like, I'm getting close to 40. I'm 38 now, and I look at like differently than I did when I was 18. And one of the things I ask myself is, what's the legacy that I want to be known for? And I realize now that a lot of the legacy and the things I want people to value about me have very little to do with work outcomes. Like, it's not
Mm.
about, what was the grade of my school in, 2015, or, how many accolades I got in any given year, but it's much more what kind of person was I? How did I show up in the space for people? How did people see me as a person who cared about the whole them and not just the work them, or, whatever it might be. And so I think I value more of those things over time. And one of the things that's been healthy for me is, you get to the point where you're not chasing a title anymore. You're chasing purpose, right? And I think I'm at the point in my career where purposeful work is the most important work I can do and the most important work I'm interested in. I think if I stop today in education and decide to do something else, I could look back and be proud at much of the work that's been done, and that I left it in a better place than I found it, right? And I think that when you're in that space, it takes some of the pressure off of I have to be seen as an achiever, because I see myself as an achiever, and I know that I've had impact on lives and tried to continue to support people. And so any outside perspective that I might have looked for validation for or from previously, I feel a lot more comfortable just walking in my own path.
That hits home for me. I'm going through a lot of the same process now. So I just turned 34 at the time of recording this last Friday. And I've just been thinking about the legacy that thanks, man. The legacy that I'm going to be able to leave behind, and the purpose of the work that I do now is really important. One thing that's interesting about our generation is we came from the before time. I mean, before the internet, before the explosion of social media, before all this other technology. How are you kind of thinking about the wildness that is innovation with things like artificial intelligence and everything else that plays a role in education today? Because there's two camps that I always see when it comes to AI. When educators think about it, they're like, no, because you're going to forge all your homework. You're going to be using it to cheat XYZ. Or the other side is this can be an accelerator to help us do things differently and do different types of knowledge work. How are you thinking about artificial intelligence and the role it plays in education?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm excited to explore how, whether it's AI or just advanced technology in general, can help us do better things for kids. And I'm also willing to and excited to explore what are the safeguards we need to have in place to maximize the impact. I don't think that one side totally has it figured out and is correct, but I do think that there's a pathway that we need to be willing to engage on to be able to ensure that we figure out how to use these things in a way that bolster young people's experiences in the classroom, outside the classroom. I think in a world where we're worried about is a kid going to cheat on a paper, that's a very restricted world, right? Because, truth be told, many kids aren't writing papers in the same way. We're asking kids to put presentations together. We're asking kids to be able to do oral presentation. We're asking for a lot more things than just write a paper and then turn it into the teacher. And, many of our young teachers don't necessarily have the experience of reading 40 papers that they had to grade and mark up, right? So that's one way. But on the other side of just saying, let's do whatever we want, I think we've seen, whether it's through social media and then other places with AI, that it's a tool that, if not used productively, can have the potential for harm, just like any other tool, right? And I think that we want to really have a engaged conversation around what are the best ways we feel to use it now, and how can we test if it actually is adding value to the experience, because it's not going away, right? And then when things aren't going away, I think we've got to engage with them authentically and have a mindset of curiosity and saying, let's see what can be true. And then what are the questions we need to be asking along the way to ensure that we're learning the right lessons?
I heard an awesome conversation the other day on Joe Rogan's podcast. There's an individual named Chamath. He was one of the original early employees at Facebook, and they were talking about the role of artificial intelligence and education. And Chamath said something that really caught my attention because it seemed like it was spot on. He said, educators, teachers in the future are going to be one of the highest esteemed positions in society because they are truly going to teach our children how to think. When you have tools like artificial intelligence that can get things done instantaneously, how we critically think about solving problems is going to be so fundamentally important in the future. And I thought that that was not only a nod to the critical role that our educators play in our children's life, but the sustained future and necessity for these teachers to help us think differently in the future as technology kind of takes away a lot of the redundant tasks that we have to do every single day. What do you think about that?
I'm excited for a future where we continue to hold our teachers in high esteem. My hope is that that trickle down, because I could see that being the world of higher ed, relatively quickly within a generation, right? Because the reality is, when the job market changes, higher ed has to respond, technical education has to respond. That's just the nature of the workforce. How fast can we get that into K through 12? Where we really start to push the envelope for how we're teaching kids, how we're building systems of accountability that really reflect what we want kids to be true and know when they can get all the answers in chat GPT, right? How do we now push them to be thinkers as opposed to technical system owners, right? And I think that that's going to be something that hopefully policy, hopefully communities can urge for, so that we can have that trickle down effect happen as soon as possible. Because I do see even the changing in our schools where we need our teachers to have those really deep intellectual questions just as much as they're building the foundational skills for kids. And the more we can both value those in lots of ways, compensation and, different avenues to make sure that the best people want to stay in that field, but also make it a critical way we think about the work, the better it is going to be for young people, I believe.
I want to give you an opportunity to call your shot like Babe Ruth. Where are we going to be at in, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years with Kairos and everything else that you've been working on, man?
Yeah, I'm excited as Kairos starts to graduate young people and put them in to not only the community force, but the workforce, to see how our students can have tangible effects on their family and the community around economic reform and community reform. I think that's some of the things that I want to track, because when we talk about making change makers, it sounds really good. You can put it on a t-shirt, but how do you quantify that and make it something that you can fully understand so that you can backwards plan from it? So when we see kids who are changing the dynamic in their family's financial structure, when they're changing the dynamic in the community structures because they understand being an empowered citizen, I'd look forward to being able to have that white paper in 5 years that says, here's the impact of our school. Because I think many of us tie the impact to things that we can control, which are test scores and, attendance rates and those things that we try to control as much as possible, when even those we don't have real control over. But being excited about long term, being able to say, here's the real impact. Our students have added, $10 million to the local community through the jobs that they've created for others and the businesses they've created. Our students, for their families, 80% of them who started below the poverty line are now above the poverty line and have families that, they define as healthy and functional, right? And being able to have those type of data points, which really talk to the change that's long term and that will have a lasting effect for generations, is what I hope we start to build a knowledge base on, and that we continue to prioritize in our work and hopefully encourage other schools to really redefine what success is for the whole human being that they get the privilege of working with.
You guys heard it here first. So in the next couple of years, when we get that white paper that's released, and Khalil talks about all the things that he just called the impact on the community, how they're changing the structure of everything that they're impacting, which is so multiplicative. I can't wait for that to come out, man. As a part of the tradition here on the podcast, the last thing we have is a previous guest wants to ask you a question. Their question was, what qualities do you believe are essential for building trust and loyalty in your team as a leader?
Wow. I've been living this process for a while. I would say, you know, two things come to mind for me. The first is empathy. Right? I think that being a person who deeply believes in the power of empathy goes a long way to build trust, because you then get a chance to not only look at the person beside you or the team alongside you, but also look at how your interactions with them lead to behaviors and outcomes, right? When I show up a certain way, other people respond to that, and having empathy that that's a process of learning from both sides becomes important. And so I think that being a person who's mindful of, do you have an empathetic experience to other people's experience, other people's learnings, other people's journey, can help them buy into trust for you. I think the other thing to build trust that I think is foundational is vulnerability, right? And it has to start with the leader, right? If the leader can't be vulnerable around not being perfect, being a person who embraces learning, being a person who wants feedback and is going to act on it when received, that becomes really hard then to build that in others because they don't see it in you. And so I think being vulnerable, one of the things, me and my team do in our weekly meetings is we have a failure of the week. And I make sure to go in that process just like everybody else. And it's usually with one of them, right? And I have to own that I didn't either show up in a certain way or didn't accomplish something that I was really eager to accomplish. And we talk about failing forward, right? And how can we not only talk about that, but how are we going to leverage it to be better? And I think things like that show and build trust because they allow for the team to see you as a human and for you to see them as a human and to know that as long as we're on the journey together, we will be better each and every day because we're going to not only push each other, but we're going to care for each other when we stop and slip and fall. And I think that that builds the type of teams that can last in any type of field.
And that is the true definition of leadership. Earlier in this week, I recorded a podcast episode with another guest named Chris Nelson. He's the CEO of Freedom Service Dogs. He helps veterans get four-legged battle buddies. And we talked about what the definition of alpha was. And his question for a guest that came before you was, how can you prove that vulnerability helps you show up as a different but more effective leader? And the elements of you just interweaving vulnerability into this, that is the true definition of what an alpha is today from our perspective, is being able to show that you don't know everything, being able to ask for help and being able to admit when you were wrong. And so Khalil, man, I just want to say thank you, man, so much for coming on the podcast. You inspired me, but everybody else who tuned in, watched and listened today, I know has learned a lot about the movement, the impact and the change that you're creating with our most important generation, man. So I just want to say thank you so much.
I appreciate you for having me as a guest. This has been a blast for me, and I'm always up to talk about how we can be better for our kids and better for our community.
Well, there we go, guys. We'll catch you in the next episode. That's a wrap.